financialized capitalism is a global phenomenon, this massive expansion of shadow banking. In a sense, it is shallow to say, oh yeah, central banks are independent. Right now, if Italy or Greece, they want to get out of the Eurozone, they would have to pay overnight half of their GDP. Once you go back to Bitcoin, what happens to banks? Nobody has really looked at the CFA franc internally. You might cut off the ties with the French colonial power, but you might end up being subordinated to the US dollar.
In this episode, we have Matteo Giordano, an economist and a co-author of the book State of Capitalism.
Very knowledgeable guy. And in this podcast, we touched on the state of capitalism, financialization, shadow banks, the Eurozone, the CFA, and cryptocurrencies.
Yeah, it was a very interesting talk. Hope you enjoy.
The Inspire Us podcast.
And of course, there are a couple of chapters in the book on imperialism that I probably explained or went through.
What did you actually write in the book?
Oh, it's a complex question, because this book is a collective. It's written by a collective, which means obviously some of us have taken the lead in writing some of the parts, but in the end, none of us takes ownership of every single page or chapter. We as a collective take ownership of the whole endeavor, and there is essentially one single voice. So most academics publish edited volumes where you have an editor or a couple of editors, and then you have 10 academics who each write a chapter. No, but we decided we didn't want that. Because those books often feel like a collection of papers. So you don't see a common thread throughout the story, whereas we wanted to have a common view, a common lens, so one single voice narrating this whole story. Really, it is a story, and so we decided, it's going to be more difficult because it's a collective, and this means essentially that there isn't a single word that we haven't all agreed upon.
See, that's what fascinated me, is that it was so many of you writing this book, and you all sort of had to have a certain, same point of view. So were there any, I don't know, I always thought, were there any clashes, or you just,
of course.
How did you,
Well, if somebody didn't agree on a certain word, we couldn't use it. Okay. So so we started during the pandemic. So, and we are also scattered around North America and Europe, and so we had a lot of conversations, a lot of sessions, and it is long and complex, and especially by the end, everyone had to read everything that other people had written, and we all had to comment on each other. So there was a lot of effort in the organization and collecting all the comments, all the reviews, and making the modifications. But no, I think it's great. But yes, of course there are clashes, but at the same time, there are some great benefits in a collective work, because when you have to write something alone, you always you might get scared that perhaps you're saying something that makes a lot of sense to you, but then it doesn't make actual sense. Whereas the collective aspect of it, in a sense, because it removes ownership from the single and it gives it to the collective, it also gives you tranquility, or more of a safer approach to what you're saying, because so many eyes had to check and think the same way as you did, that you could have not really said something totally wrong. But so I don't take ownership of anything. So I cannot answer by saying, oh, I've written this or that. But of course, when we were thinking about the book and when we were actually writing it, some sections were spearheaded by someone, and then somebody else would come and read it and add something, and then it would go through around the group, and more people would add, some people would remove, and so. As I said, there isn't really a chapter or a section that I can say. Of course, as you might know, I have some areas of expertise, so you can identify what chapters might have been the ones that I've contributed more to. But yes, we've been jumping from one to the other. Yeah.
But at the same time, it's good because everyone kind of feels like they wrote the whole book.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because capitalism is quite. For some people, controversial if you don't talk good about it, or if you don't talk bad about it. But the title is really interesting, the state of capitalism.
Yeah.
So could you say, what is the state of capitalism?
Okay, so the title, first of all, is it plays with the words, because we wanted to write this book during the pandemic when you see the state acquiring this massive role. So the whole idea was, okay, I don't remember if we came up with the title or who came up with the title exactly, but the whole idea was, okay, we are looking at capitalism, and the state has always had a big role in capitalism, even during the neoliberal era, starting in the mid to late 20th century. Government and states in general have always played a big role, but for us, the pandemic just made it clear. We all saw that actually states can do pretty much whatever they want, and yes, so we wanted to highlight this point. Now, if you ask me what is the state of capitalism, so not what the role of state within capitalism, but what the state of capitalism is, I guess the book makes this point that we are in an interregnum. It's something actually very interesting, because I was reading yesterday a short article by, I think, Adam Tooze. You might know Adam Tooze. He wrote very seminal books. He's a great economic historian and economist, but he was writing about the interregnum yesterday and how his take on interregnum, and it's a Gramscian term, and so yes, it is something that it's becoming clearer and clearer that there is this period since the global financial crisis 2007 2008 where that we define as interregnum, because we see that the old is dying, or is dead perhaps already, but the new that is supposed to replace is not born, or is not able to actually come to light. So we are in this period where something is ending, but what's next isn't there quite yet. Okay, and so it's chaotic.
Okay, Matteo, but you said the old is dying and the new is what? Sorry, I didn't quite.
It's not born yet.
Okay, could you define the old and the new for us?
Yeah, of course. With the old, well, I cannot define the new, because the new, if it's not born yet, we don't really know. But we can have ideas of where it might go. Or better, we might have plans of where we would like to see it going. But the old is the neoliberal capitalist system that we have seen in the last 30, 40 years of deregulated finance, of a core, meaning Europe, Northern America, a core that is falling in the sense that investments are going down, or have been going down and are already quite low. At the same time, production and productive capital, in radical economic terms, productive capital becomes internationalized, and financial capital at the same time becomes financialized, so that you see this globalization, which is a term that isn't really narrow or specific, but in economic terms we can talk about productive capital and financial capital that dominate over the world economy. They've expanded, and perhaps now they're being challenged, or perhaps they should be challenged. And this is the old that is dying. This is, or at least this is what you saw in 2007 and 2008 when the global financial crisis hit, and that's what you're seeing now, where you're seeing trade and globalization being slightly on the reversal, where you see supply chains issues and perhaps the production that was scaled on an international level, perhaps now being onshore again.
Okay, but on that topic, do you know what really fascinates me? So we're seeing this trend of, everyone wants industrial policy back, isolationist almost the US, and, everyone really made in China, made in the US, made in Europe. That kind of seems the direction of, the many different spheres. But what are the consequences of this? We're so used to this globalized world and outsourcing production.
Yeah.
And it's been 40 years of this disinflationary trend, would you say? Do you ever wonder what are the ramifications? We've so become accustomed to this life, and I always think, how is this going to end up? I don't know.
You're feeling one of the first consequences. The consequence is that bringing things onshore leads to a pickup in inflation. So that's perhaps the first consequence that you can really see. When the production chains break down, the production chains that were disinflationary in nature, or that allowed at least for us to purchase goods at very low prices, once they break down, or you try to reshore production, you start seeing some inflation at least. Because of course you have changing costs. You have perhaps to set up new factories, but also just the workers that you have to pay are going to have to be remunerated at the level within the national economy. So I'd say that is the first consequence that you already can acknowledge, and you can see everywhere. I mean, the inflation after the COVID, or during and after the pandemic, is driven by the supply side, precisely because we let production fall down in the UK, for example, and we haven't really kept up with the production capacity of that would allow us at least to reshore easily our production system. This is the simplest consequence. In terms of what you might also be able to see then is the ramifications in terms of at the international level, the conflict, or the economic conflict, of course, as well as non-economic conflict, but the economic conflict to attract the few activities that are kept offshore. I guess these are a couple of the ramifications, but there are political ramifications as well, of course. It becomes a matter of class struggle as well. And there have been lots of studies on the effect of offshoring and the onshoring of production, and the democratic process, and seeing exactly what constituency is affected by the process of offshoring or onshoring. And but we see it every day. We saw it a couple of weeks ago with the election, and exactly. And we are going to see it in the United States in a couple of months with the election process, and exactly who the candidates are going to target and what are the means that they're going to use to target those constituencies.
Okay. But do you feel, because there was this idea that now that we're globalized, that it's okay to offshore because everyone trades with us anyways, and then COVID kind of changed that. Now everyone's kind of taking a step back and talking about America, or even now the EU, everyone wants to produce, bring back manufacturing, bring back. Do you feel like that's the right move to bring back, or should we continue pushing globalization?
Well, so now there is a word that's it's been used by economists, especially in developing countries, for decades, or for almost a century, I guess, and that is the principle of autarchy. So the idea of having countries that are autarchic, in the sense that not that they are closed from the international economy, but that are able to sustain themselves autonomously, that is a principle that, in my opinion, should be pursued. It's been, for example, argued that developing countries might be able to acquire sovereignty, monetary, but sovereignty in general, by being autarchic, by being able to produce their own food, to produce their own energy, and without relying essentially on the international markets for food and energy, which are dollar-based. So you need to have revenue in dollar in order to pay the primary resources. So the idea of having autarkic policies or industrial policies that promote autarky, again, autarky not in the sense that you decide to shut off your economy from the rest of the world, but in the sense that you are willing and able to sustain your basic needs, or what you at least you're able not to rely on international commodity market. And that is, I think, a viable set of policies.
Because if we push globalization to its extent, then maybe countries would even push out food and agriculture, say we don't need to produce that, we can just get it somewhere else. So,
but I think on that note, aren't most hyperinflation caused by this trade imbalance? You know, it's a lot of Venezuela, Zimbabwe. It's this trade imbalance where they keep on facing dollar shortages, and this dynamic is really what causes inflation in these countries. So, you know, what do you say? What was the word you used for describing sovereignty or autonomy within a country?
Autarchy.
Yeah,
Autarchy. Yeah. Yes.
So this, you think, is key for most of these developing
nations?
Yeah,
I think it's key not to rely on the international commodity markets, because the international commodity markets are very volatile and they're dollar-based, which means that if you're a developing country, you will have to acquire dollars one way or the other to pay for those commodities. So if you are Venezuela, and you don't have really a problem perhaps with energy, but you might have a problem with food. How are you going to pay for food? You're going to have to sell something in exchange for dollars, and then, of course, your currency is not going to be enough. The value of your currency for dollars might be very low, so that's not viable. So you're going to have to sell something, acquire dollars, and then pay in dollars the producers of food. And if you are not able to sell anything for dollars, or if the price of those commodities or food prices, for example, just skyrocket for whatever reason, then you're going to suffer. As a developing country, you're going to suffer famine or whatever we are talking about. So yeah, I think you should be insulating yourself from international commodity markets, especially because they are dollar-based. And but you were talking also of production and broader. Those are political as well as economic considerations. Of course, I do think that industrial policies and the maintaining a solid productive base instead of shifting purely to services should be pursued. Especially, there is. In development, you should be trying to, you're going to have Hajan Chang, but you want to shift to high value added goods and services. So you want to produce goods that require high skills, and that can be done. That can be done in Europe. I even think some programs around 2015, I think in Greece, when the famous when we had the elections and Syriza won, some of the programs there were precisely to push Greece to become like the Silicon Valley of Europe, to make it produce a lot of high-tech goods and also, of course, the services behind those goods. Of course, it didn't materialize because then it becomes a political decision, and also you have the pressures of the Eurozone. You cannot spend money. The fiscal industrial policy is very difficult in Europe to carry out. But I do think that it can be and it should be implemented. But I would say that autarky, perhaps it's the first level that you need to be able to assure, and then you can carry on with very targeted industrial policy.
Okay.
Do you feel like, because we talked about how many people equate neoliberalism with capitalism, though we can talk about how that may be true or not?
Yes, neoliberalism is an ideology. Capitalism isn't an ideology. So that's if you want the philosophical difference. But But if people are confused, neoliberalism is an ideology. Then there are, of course, some policies that are prescribed, but in itself, neoliberalism is an ideology. Capitalism isn't an ideology. So that's perhaps the easiest difference that one can keep in mind to differentiate the two.
You would say it's a mistake to think of neoliberal ideas to be capitalism.
To do what? Sorry, to be the same thing as capitalism? Yes, capitalism is a productive system. It's been there for 300 years, something like that. Neoliberalism is an ideology that arises after World War II, so in the second half of the 20th century. They're very different. They're very different concepts, very different things. The fact that then, of course, neoliberalism puts in place some policies that facilitate the expansion or the dominance of capital over the economy. Of course. Neoliberalism and neoliberal policies can polarize, if you want, capitalism. But in itself, different things. We're talking about apple and oranges, okay?
But you would agree that neoliberalism has massively polarized capitalism?
Well, yeah, that's the whole point of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism and the various policies, it's easy to remember them, but liberalization, deregulation, privatization, and so on, these are all policies that, and not to mention the crackdown on the labor unions and the unification of labor across industries. Of course, those facilitate the accumulation of capital and the domination of capital over labor.
That was a very interesting point in the book. It was just kind of how, financialization and neoliberalism are kind of responsible for hollowing out the productive capacity of lots of Western nations, especially the US and England. And financialization has kind of become this monster in our economies, let's say. And most of the, money is concentrated within a few square meters of the capital cities. And we kind of left behind all these.
Especially now in the city of London.
Yeah, and we've left behind a lot of these old industrial places up north and, in the Midlands. And what is the future? Like, where are we even heading to with financialization? It seems like an elephant in the room that people don't really want to address. This is surely just not sustainable, And
I guess, first of all, what is financialization? That's because we don't have a single
Is there no definition for it? Is it just...
Well, there isn't a definition because it's a very complex phenomenon. And so there are many definitions. But even within the orthodox economics sphere, there are several definitions. You can take even colleagues who work together most of the time might have slightly or radically different definitions of financializations. But no, there are. I mean, what do you have an idea of what financialization is? Because there are the simple definitions that are just fine. They do describe roughly what is happening, but then there are the more complex definitions that might be able to explain financialization as more.
Could I tell you?
Yes.
I can't remember what I was watching, but someone described financialization simply as betting. He said it's just gambling. Do you agree with that, or is that too reductionist?
Well, yeah, because the Great Depression and Wall Street in the 1920s, isn't that betting as well? There is a difference between finance, stock exchanges, and financialization. So betting, quote unquote, that can be a practice that is carried out in financial markets, in like a stock exchange, regardless. That's speculative behavior. It occurs within financialization or also outside of financialization. So perhaps it comes out more with financialization, but I don't think it tends to confuse financialization with finance. Because see, the most generic understanding of financialization is, just expansion of finance. Finance is becoming dominant. It's finance and not production. So the importance of finance is just overwhelming. Is it wrong? No, it is true. Finance is becoming more and more important, as you were mentioning. It's more and more centralized. But is that financialization? To me, no, it's not. To me, I take part in a relatively new. I mean, it's very old school of thought, but the theorization of financialization it has occurred over the last 20 years. But for us, and in this book also, financialization is described as an epochal change in capitalism. So it's not a phase. Okay, it's a reinvention of capitalism, and specifically we define financialization with three behaviors, really. And these are the behaviors that affect banks, commercial banks, non-financial corporations, and households. It's interesting because the theorization of financialization that we carry out in this book, as well as in the economic articles, it derives from scholars who wrote in the early 20th century, primarily Hilferding, who recognized the importance of finance. But of course, when Hilferding writes Finance Capital, his most prominent book, he writes about the relationship between finance, banks, and productive capital. But he's not able to describe what financialization is, of course, because it's not there yet. So by taking Hilferding and his approach and understanding, Hilferding, of course, a Marxian scholar who's in the tradition together with Lenin, Kautsky, and Luxemburg, and so on, by taking those scholars and understanding, okay, so to understand capitalism, you have to look at how finance capital and productive capital relate to one another. Then you're able to look at the 1960s, 1970s onwards and see, okay, non-financial corporations, how do they finance themselves? What is the liability structure of non-financial corporations? They used to borrow from banks. This is Hilferding as well. What are they doing now? Well, now they're not. Now, non-financial corporations are issuing on the stock market. So they issue shares instead of borrowing from banks. So that's the first behavioral change, if you want. Non-financial corporations that finance themselves in the capital markets. Expansion of finance, capital markets, but it's not bank finance, it's market-based finance. Then, so what happens if if non-financial corporations fund themselves in capital markets and not with banks? Well, banks have a problem now, right? Because they used to extend all these loans that had an interest, and then they would get back the loans, the principal and the interest. That was their business. So if now banks are not in the position of lending to non-financial corporations quite as much, how are they going to remain profitable? Here comes the households. They are going to lend to households now. And here you see the increase in mortgages and the increase in credit card loans, car loans, and so on. And this is the second relationship. So banks that shift from non-financial corporations to household lending, and then you see households who are becoming more and more indebted. Why? Because they cannot keep up with the increases in the cost of living, and because of inequality as well, and because they need to finance consumption with borrowing, and so you see households needing actually the lending from banks. So the understanding of financialization in this book, or at least the financialization until the second half of the last decade. Okay, so until, if you want, 2018, 2019, is an epochal change of capitalism in which these three relationships become crucial: non-financial corporations borrowing from capital markets, households increasing their debt and borrowing from banks, and banks lending not to non-financial corporations but to households. Now, that was financialization, or in a sense, that was financialization 1.0. Now it's slightly different. We have a chapter or two in the book that describes shadow banking. So that is slightly different, because we can see that now financialization is moving, or it's slightly different from what it was 20 years ago or 30 years ago. Not only we still have these three relationships, but we also have this massive expansion of shadow banking, of these non-bank financial corporations and of the money dealing that expand even more the importance of finance, but it also keeps finance circulating in itself. So that is, if you want, the new avenue of research on financialization, or the new way, what we need to define next if we want to carry on understanding financialization with our lens.
So could you define then what shadow banking is? It's quite new, and many people are starting to hear about these institutions like BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, that own, they say, like more than 10, 15, 20 trillion.
Yeah.
And there's like a statistic where they say they own their major holders in 80% of the S&P 500, which is, crazy, and no one saw this coming.
Yeah,
but
it is.
So what is a little bit shadow banking, and kind of what effect has this on our economy?
So again, multiple definitions, more technical, less technical. In terms of technicality, I really like Perry Merling's definition that shadow banking is money market borrowing for capital market lending. So you borrow short term, and you invest that in long term in capital markets, which have longer maturities. What does it mean? It means that you have to keep rolling over your debts in order to keep on doing your business. Now, in simpler terms, for non-finance people, it's the expansion of all those financial corporations that are not banks. So you have hedge funds, investment banks, pension systems, pension funds, and so on. All of this and their increased lending and borrowing, or their increased investments in securities, generally speaking, that is the expansion of shadow banking. As you mentioned BlackRock, you mentioned other private equity funds. These are all shadow banks that are not regulated, because, of course, shadow banks are called shadow banks because they can play roles that are similar to banks lending, essentially, although it's not exactly the same. But they're not banks. They cannot offer deposits. They cannot take deposits from customers. And as a consequence, they are not regulated by anyone. Because, of course, commercial banks have this trade-off where they are placed in this very peculiar position in the economy, where they have some depositors, they can extend loans, they have the access to the central bank if they need to, but in exchange for this guaranteed or almost guaranteed access to the central bank if they need to, they have to be regulated. So there are various regulations, Basel 1, 2, 3, and so on. Shadow banks, on the other hand, because they're not banks and they cannot technically access the central bank balance sheet, they cannot ask the central bank to bail them out, essentially, they don't have to be regulated. And so they are completely unregulated, and which means that they can take extremely leveraged position, extremely risky positions, or they can make use of fascinating financial engineering practices, or they can. There is a whole set of tools that they can make use of to extract profits, of course, and without being regulated by anyone. Now, of course, there have been shifts now in saying, oh, perhaps we should start to regulate shadow banks precisely because it's becoming such a huge sector and so crucial for both banks but also non-financial corporations. Then there have been some pushes to regulate them, but it's
still quite new.
Yes, and it's the regulation is again a political process, and we've seen it with all the Basel regulation. You have very nice proposals, and then you have lobbying, and you see a huge amount of money spent on lobbying by banks. And in the case you start regulating shadow banks, you would see spent by the shadow banks. And after all the rounds of consultations over the regulation, they are watered down to a ghost of what they looked like at the beginning. So we will see where that goes. Really, it has to be an international effort, or at least there needs to be some coordination amongst countries for them to regulate the shadow banks.
Okay, that's quite interesting. And since BlackRock, they're the largest shadow bank, right? Is that correct? Or is that not?
Yeah, I mean, shadow bank has so many different sectors within it. We shouldn't really be saying, "Oh, it's the largest shadow bank." Yeah, technically, I think you might be correct. I'm not sure that it's exactly the most accurate way of formulating it, because shadow banking system, it's just an accumulation of institutions that do so many different things. You cannot really compare a pension fund with an hedge fund or with a dealer. So perhaps we should be distinguishing them.
Okay.
But yeah, anyway.
But I was just reading about their role in the global financial crisis, and I found it quite peculiar. And they came up with this risk management tool called Aladdin, and they were the ones sort of auditing these other companies. I think the state stepped in and they asked BlackRock to use this tool they had to audit all of the other banks and shadow banks which had become liquidated in this whole process. And it kind of just seemed like, to me, it was the private sector, like managing the private sector. And I don't know, this whole industry, shadow banking, it sounds quite insidious, but I don't know. Do you think as shadow banks continue to play a larger role in our economy and in finance, it's going to have some serious implications in the future? Or?
Yeah. So first of all, it is private sector taking care of the private sector, but don't forget the role of the state, because shadow banks rely on money markets. Money markets these days, or at least until a year and a half ago, they were incorporated into the central banks. The central banks are there to, at least, of course, in the developed world, in advanced countries, their central banks have been intervening. Every time that there is an issue in the money markets, central banks step in and calm them down. So, central banks have even started opening up some facilities to shadow banks for very extreme times. So again, still in the sense of what we were talking about with the neoliberalism, yes, the state is not involved, but actually the state is involved. The neoliberalism, although its policies are that of privatization, deregulation, and so on, so it appears that the ideology of neoliberalism is to remove the state from economic activity or social activities as well. The reality is that neoliberal policies work only if there is a state underneath it, and there is actually a lot of state intervention to provide the ground for the market. And of course, when I talk about state intervention, then central bank, being it a public institution, even if there were private banks in the past, but these days they are public institutions, their operations in money market would essentially represent the state supporting money markets and, as a consequence, supporting shadow banks. In terms of the repercussions, of course, the point is they do extremely risky business. They shadow banks are at the very heart of financial markets, and we can take this in many different avenues. But since we're here, we can take it in one of the easiest avenue possible, and that is, we've seen what happens when pension funds and the use of government bonds as for their liability management don't coincide with the operations of the Treasury, with the Liz Truss a couple of years ago. So again, that mini budget was or the shock was caused by, yes, the Treasury and the way in which it operated, but also by the liability management of the pension funds, which are shadow banks. Okay, so the role of shadow banks within capital markets and money markets plays a crucial role, or is fundamental because of the different practices that they carry out, each one of them independently and slightly different, and because of the fact that without regulations, they are able to take on massive risk, take on, when we talk about risk, but there are different types of risk. They might take on risk on themselves, simply like counterparty risk, interest rate risk, and so on, but they also might take on or create what is called systemic risk, in the sense that shadow banks might, or some shadow instruments like the repurchase agreements, the repo, the famous repo that also have become quite prominent in the conversations, might become systemic, in the sense that if those markets fail, then the whole financial system, like the fiber of the financial system, it becomes shaky. Becomes shaky and is a threat to the stability of the financial system, and by extension of banks. And once you take banks in, then the depositors and whoever uses a bank, which is everyone, becomes in danger, essentially. So the repercussions are essentially that if you have a financial system that revolves around shadow banking, or at least that is being dominated now by shadow banking, and not only financial system, but also non-financial corporations relying on capital markets where shadow banking institutions operate, you have a threat. You have a threat to the stability of the system, and by extension, then, because of financialization, to the whole economy.
Okay.
It gets very complex, and there are different avenues that we can explore. But I think summarized, this is the danger. Again, you see it with you can see it by looking at BlackRock or other institutions, or you can look at it by exploring markets and instruments and saying, okay, what happens if that market fails? So what happens if that market, like it happened during the global financial crisis, what happens if it breaks down? And then you see, well, if that market breaks down, nobody is able to fund themselves, or there are going to be massive increases in funding costs. What does it mean for shadow banks? What does it mean for commercial banks? And you see the whole fiber getting destroyed, essentially.
And this is why, as capitalism becomes more financialized, central banks have a more prominent role in just ensuring the fabrication and
exactly.
Why
in a neoliberal sense?
Yeah.
That's the ironic part, that they become more involved, even though they still follow the neoliberal ideology, which to the common observer, if you want, appears like a paradox. The fact that you need more central bank intervention to actually carry out neoliberal policies.
This is what bemuses me as well. It's kind of defeats. It's against what they're saying. The central.
No, it's not. It's actually.
It's for what they're saying.
It's part and parcels.
But like
because it cannot survive without. The point is, you need to have it masked. The state has been there. It's just that it's not been active, but it's been there to provide the pillars upon which then the market, or the stability of market, in this case you were mentioning central bank, then operated. So it is there.
But could we talk a bit more about central banks? And because they're sort of essentially they're outsourcing economic policy. And
what do you mean? Expand that.
Economic policy has, political ramifications. These things affect real people's lives. So do you think they should be independent? Are you an advocate for an independent central bank? Wasn't Keynes, correct me if I'm wrong, wasn't he against independent central banks? Okay. Somewhat. I just wanted to hear your thoughts,
Yeah. So again, what does it mean for a bank to be independent, for a central bank to be independent? Because there are many different levels of independence. There is a legal independence. There is operational independence. There is an independence in setting its own goals, its own objectives. So I suppose the importance is not on the conversation should not only be whether a central bank should be independent or not, but whether central banks and treasuries, so monetary and fiscal policy, and also then whoever is in charge of financial policy, whether they should cooperate or not. So cooperation amongst monetary and fiscal authorities, that would impair independence in the operation of central banks, because you would have then the treasury that perhaps, essentially you can take the example of the mini budget again, but you can have the treasury that says, look, the borrowing costs are too high, can you please step in and buy some of our government bonds when we issue them, so that you lower the interest rate that we have to pay, and essentially we can fund fiscal policy at a lower cost. So that is one side of cooperation. It's been frowned upon, and I kind of see the point, because because of the issue that because of the problem that governments then might want to carry out more expansionary fiscal policy to be re-elected, and they might ask the central bank to fund at least partially those fiscal policy programs, and this would lead to inflationary pressures. So there are some cases, of course, for the independence of central bank, and again, as I said, there are different types of independence that one should discuss. But if you want my opinion is that the reality is that central banks aren't independent. They're not independent for the simple reason that something is gonna break in the economy, and central banks have to respond. That to me isn't independence. They might be independent in the sense that they are an institution and they cannot be affected by the government. Yes, legal independence, but because the transmission of monetary policy is via the financial system, via banks, and because banks use collateral that is the safe asset in our financial systems is government bonds. It's impossible. It's by definition it is impossible for the central bank and the financial and the fiscal authorities to be independent of one another in terms of their actions. The central bank will always have to take into consideration what the fiscal authorities do, and vice versa. Again, was the Bank of England independent when it had to purchase bonds because of the mini budget, because of the old the gilt market was breaking down? Well, nobody asked the Bank of England to buy it, so technically speaking, it was independent. But then it was forced to act because of the breakdown of the gilt market. So to me, that is not. It's not independence. As a matter of fact, I'm doing some research on this very topic with a colleague of mine, where precisely this, because of the instruments used in the financial system, and because of the role of banks at the heart of the transmission mechanism of monetary policy, it becomes very not shallow, but in a sense, it is shallow to say, "Oh, yeah, central banks are independent and they can set out the direction of monetary policy and of economic policy autonomously." The reality is, they're always going to respond to something. They're always going to be lagging behind what happens in the market and having to respond. Now, if you want to call that independence, to me, that is not. Independence from the economic system. Okay, as I said, they are independent legally and operationally, because nobody's telling the central bank, "Oh, you have to set the interest rate this high," or "You don't have to set the interest rate that high," or "You have to buy bonds. You don't have to buy bonds." No, nobody's telling them, but they are always responding. So they're never actually independent in the behavior that they are setting out.
Okay,
that's why they always have a reaction function. Even if you look at their models, they have a reaction function. How are they going to react to what happens in the market? And that is for the interest rate. But once you expand it to the gilts and government bonds in general, and their asset purchasing programs, they always are there to react to what the market is doing, and to what the treasury is also doing. And if they screw up, then the central bank has to interact, and that's not independence. I'm sorry, but that's not independence.
Okay, so it's wrong to call central banks independent. Is essentially what you're saying. I guess there has to be some level of cooperation.
We can say independence that they are independent, smiling, because we both know that actually in the end, if we screw up, the central bank is going to come and save us. Again, as I said, call it independence, but I don't. If it, what is that saying? If it swims like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, then it probably is a duck. So if it behaves not very independently, then probably it isn't independent.
And we talked about the growth of financialization. With that, central banks also grew quite a lot in power and their presence.
Precisely because the financialization led to a crisis of financialization, or to several crises of financialization. And as those crises took place, the central bank was forced to react. And if, again, not being independent, but having to react, then they had to expand. And they expanded massively their operations. That's the quality and the quantity of operations that they put in place with various rounds of QE and quantitative easing and so on. And they've expanded so much that, I mean, you could see 2019 especially, money markets were not private markets anymore. It was the central banks that were so interventionist in those markets that they essentially were integrated in the central bank balance sheet. So yeah, they expanded, but it's all connected to what we've been discussing, because the role of central banks is of paramount importance, especially in the context of financialization.
So you see, during the pandemic, Jerome Powell was under so much scrutiny for the amount of quantitative easing that went on. And I remember seeing loads of commentators just kind of calling him despicable, and he's ruining the dollar, and he's ruining our financial system. But what was the alternative? What else was he to do? Was he perhaps to implement some more direct stimuluses to? I'm just trying to. What were the options then?
He can't implement more direct stimuli. Central banks are in that. I like central banks. Don't get me wrong. I think it's fascinating, but they are in that weird position in which they have control only over indirect levers. They cannot carry out fiscal policy, so they cannot carry out investments, and they cannot carry out industrial policy. All they can do is to push people, like with a stick, pushing banks in one direction. That's also, if you want, the conversation over climate change. Central banks that they cannot really do anything for climate change directly. What they can do is put in place some policies or some rules that would incentivize the private sector to act in a way that would fund green investments and so on. But so with respect to the pandemic, the central bank couldn't do anything else. The only thing that the central bank could do was to provide the very lax monetary policy that they did. Nothing else. That's why, the pandemic was the great example that we actually pretty much all realized, again, I'm talking about the global north, that the central bank only could do so much, but it was the fiscal side, the government, that needed to implement, to step up. And that's why in the US we had the fiscal stimulus check that arrived a couple of times to all the families. So I suppose it was the government side that perhaps was more to blame for perhaps increasing aggregate demand a little too much, or at least putting the foundations for aggregate demand to be slightly too high once the pandemic ended. Because, of course, those stimuli, the checks were put as savings, because when there is high uncertainty, you save more. And as the pandemic actually was relatively brief compared to what expectations might have been, then we started dissaving those checks. But those didn't come out of the Federal Reserve. They came out of the federal government. and same here or anywhere else in Europe. It was the government that carry out expansionary fiscal policy with direct checks. The central banks did what they could, and they did well. They prevented the financial breakdowns, and central banks operate very well. You can see it with the Silicon Valley Bank as well. What is it? Well, a year and a half ago, I guess. So
you think the Jerome Powell criticism was a bit unjust?
Well, yes. He was faced with a crisis that wasn't financial, and so there is the issue of zombie firm. That is an issue, but that was an issue with QE and has remained an issue with the pandemic. So the response within the pandemic period, I don't think that there should be quite as high of a criticism.
But weren't zombie firms more related to, the decades of cheap finance and the cost of borrowing being just basically next to nothing?
Yeah.
I find it very interesting because a lot of commentators, they say it just spurred a lot of unproductive projects. I think ESG essentially being one of them.
That's the concept of zombie firms. Firms that should have gone bankrupt years ago, but that have remained active just because of the cheap finance. I agree that is a big issue, and that is like a tsunami that we thought was coming much earlier, but sooner or later they're going to come for this. It's pretty much like real estate, commercial real estate. We all know, or at least for the past 2-3 years, we economists knew that commercial real estate was on the brink of collapse because with work from home and other dynamics, there wasn't the demand for commercial real estate that was there 10 years ago, and we kept building skyscrapers for offices and buildings. But it's not really materialized. We haven't suffered the famous commercial real estate crisis that we might have thought. The same with zombie firms. It is a problem, and if you look at the data, they are out there, but they haven't collapsed quite yet. But yes, I agree with you. But that is not a criticism of the pandemic. That is a criticism of the lax monetary policy or QE in general, because that is a program that was started 15 years ago in the United States, but longer in the 25 years than 30 almost in Japan.
Okay, that's quite interesting. And on that note, you see, so you think Jerome Powell was scrutinized a bit too much for, his quantitative easing. And I also think, especially in the Anglosphere where they not benefit, but, having the central bank step in and ensure liquidity, ensure the financial system keeps them running is it's a benefit. Because I was reading about a lot of these developing countries, when the pandemic hit, they didn't have this luxury of, they just have to suffer all these shocks. And also in the book, you mentioned financialization and its impact on peripheral countries, especially because, these multinational corporations come and they kind of create enclave economies, and also about capital flows, and they're kind of susceptible to these withdrawals of capital flows. I think the 80s, Latin America, 90s, the Asian financial crisis.
Exactly.
And so would you agree or say that financialization, perhaps the peripheral countries have, they bear the brunt of it more than anyone else?
Yeah, absolutely. That is crucial, and that is something that is often not discussed by economists, or primarily development economists are the ones who look at these asymmetric effects. And of course, they're crucial. And of course, the periphery, the global periphery, is exposed to the whims of capital to a much higher extent, and especially because financial capital is much more volatile than productive capital. And so we can have the famous capital flow bonanzas and then reversals that you mentioned. Absolutely. And this is something that is often left on the side, or even in our conversation, we've primarily discussed the national aspect of economic policy and of financialization. But of course, financialization take a global approach, because capitalism is a global phenomenon. It's very difficult to talk about American capitalism, because it's of course a global phenomenon in itself. And yes, so it's a whole conversation, the periphery, okay? Because there are many theories. There are theories throughout time, and there are different observations. And then also we would have to look at different countries. Of course, Latin America is different from East Asia, different from Africa. But yes, the periphery is definitely the periphery is constrained in the fact that in the sense that they don't have the tools to oppose, or to at least to remedy to the crisis that might arise with financialization, or also with other types of crises like the pandemic. And but then also financialization itself takes a slightly different form in the periphery. There will be the famous three dimensions that I mentioned earlier are still at play, but in slightly modified versions, in the sense that if you're a Brazilian multinational corporation, or if you're a Brazilian corporation and you need to borrow, you can go to the Brazilian real market and you can borrow in reals. But if you are a multinational corporation, then you might just go and borrow in the United States in dollars. So you see, when we had financialization in the quote unquote core, in the advanced countries, they non-financial corporations relied on their domestic markets, or at least we are talking about the European markets and the United States, and but mostly national. Whereas now with developing countries, or with emerging market economies, they have this opportunity of relying on foreign sources of finance. And that takes a whole different, that makes financialization even more fragile, because taking on foreign funding means that you need to secure the revenue in the currency that you are borrowing in. If you're taking a loan in dollar, you have to pay it back in dollar, and you cannot do otherwise. And because of the whimsical financial capital that we were mentioning earlier, or because some central banks have overwhelming consequences on the rate of interest in specific markets, the United States, of course, if the Fed increases the interest rate, everyone in the world will feel the consequences of the increase in the interest rate by the Federal Reserve. The periphery will be exposed, and corporations in the periphery that had this possibility of financializing with an eye on their national economy, but an eye also on transnational finance, then, and often cheaper transnational finance, then the financialization process is slightly different, and they become twice as exposed as the non-financial corporations could be in the advanced countries. So yeah, the periphery is in a much worse position, both in terms of how the public sector can react, but also in terms of the forces at play for the non-financial corporations and financial corporations as well.
Okay.
And of course, households, clearly.
Just on the topic, because we were talking about central banks, I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on modern monetary theory, MMT?
Well, the first criticism of MMT is, first of all, it's not, there is, we are like, I say we, but again, the monetary theory that we have in our book and that we have in heterodox economics, we have multiple monetary theories in heterodox economics. We have the ones that are more of a Marxian approach, then we have the more post-Keynesian, and MMT is by nature a post-Keynesian theory, or economic theory. Now, MMT is correct in many respects, and it isn't. I mean, ontologically, they have a credit theory of money, which is different from what others might have, which are more like monetary theory of credit. But they understand, of course, how banks work, how money works. It is absolutely correct that technically speaking, governments cannot go bankrupt and so on. There are some issues, however, with MMT, at least from our understanding. Or
Could you say what is MMT?
modern monetary theory, or in the American, I guess we say modern monetary theory in the UK, but in the US they say modern money theory. So it's the same thing. So MMT, there are prescriptive and descriptive sides of MMT, and I don't think that it can really be summarized in a one word or a one sentence definition. But my understanding of it is that they understand how monetarily sovereign countries cannot go bankrupt. And if you take this position, then it becomes clear that taxes are not the funding, or better, that government expenditures have to come first, and the government puts in circulation money, and taxes are a way to remove money from circulation, and especially to manage aggregate demand rather than to finance government expenditure. So MMT, it starts with a certain understanding of what money is, and again, as I mentioned, they have a credit theory of money, or what is also within the credit theories of money, they belong to the cartelist approach, from carta, the Latin word carta, and that means token, so that money essentially is a token. And as I said, that is essentially the repercussions of this understanding of what money is. Now, there are, it's a very, the definition, I mean, I would suggest you read, anyone who wants to understand MMT can read papers, academic, but also non-academic papers. There are a couple of books published by Randall Wray, who explain what MMT is. It's from the early 2000s, I think. Precisely because, I mean, it has to be coupled with very specific socioeconomic policies, like an employer of last resort, and so on. But I'll leave it. So I just wanted to outline that it's not that there is. Okay, so there are some very deep contrasts between what we argue in this book and what MMT argues. Some very deep contrasts in the sense that the theory that informs, or the understanding of what money is that informs the two approaches is very different. But we can leave that on the side. That becomes a philosophical or historical project. Now, of course, credit can become money. And of course, the money that we use today is an IOU, is a form of credit. And then we have fiat money. In practice, however, the position that we take on MMT is that, well, first of all, I guess MMT kind of downplays the effects that money, or the large printing of money, has on financial speculation. So I think it is. MMTers, although they are related to the Minskian approach, there are some aspects of MMT that let question arise about the financial stability aspect of the policies that would be argued in favor by MMT. So essentially, if you have very expansionary monetary policy, then what we argue is that this is going to be very dangerous in terms of financial stability. And you have to have a set of policies that are able to guarantee financial stability, even in the context of an expansionary monetary policy. And I don't think that there have been some proposals. I think that there are some ideas within the MMT framework, but I haven't seen like a white paper of proposals of how and how financial stability can be reconciled with expansionary monetary policy. Now, the second issue that I think is more important, that the first was just like a comment. The second one is what we were talking about. MMT is only applicable to the national, to a country that is monetarily sovereign. But you cannot look at a country that is monetary sovereign, full stop. Like, okay, you can look at the United States, but even if you look at the United States, capitalism and financialized capitalism is a global phenomenon. It's going to be very difficult to evaluate the effects of economic policy if you're looking at the state, at the country in itself, because it's a monetary sovereign country. Yeah, it is true that the United States cannot, technically speaking, default. It is true that they can always mint the coin. There is this famous coin that could be minted if the government needed $1 billion overnight, something like that. But it doesn't say anything about peripheral countries. It cannot help peripheral countries. And if you think about it, there is one core and there are endless peripheries. So even Europe finds itself in a very precarious position. I wouldn't call us Europe, not only the Eurozone specific, but I mean European countries in the European continent. I wouldn't define us ourselves as monetary sovereign or fully monetary sovereign. Monetary sovereign is more of a spectrum than a binomial quality. So outside of the United States, it's not very informative to have MMT. Now, it is interesting. One MMTers, I think, did mention, or at least I think at least I remember reading and talking to this scholar some time ago. But there were some connections between monetary sovereignty and autarchy. So there is this recognition that MMT is lacking for peripheral countries, and so perhaps it can be actually connected to acquiring sovereignty over food, energy, and so on. And then once you are sovereign over those areas, you can become also monetary sovereign. I don't know, but as I said, it is very lacking in terms of international of the periphery. And lastly, I think that the third criticism that we have here is that it lacks the supply side. So, but most theories do these days. But the MMT has an employer of last resort, ELR. It was famous in the Green New Deal that, for example, was in the conversations around the Green New Deal that were discussed in the United States half a decade ago.
MMT really pushes the Green New Deal that says that it can be funded.
Exactly. The Green New Deal arises from essentially MMT scholars who say, look, we actually can fund this stuff. We should be implementing this kind of policies, and we should fund those policies in these ways. The issue is there isn't a lot said on the supply side. Yes, you have the Green New Deal, but the policies suggested by MMT are more policies that help to maintain macroeconomic stability. Like the ELR, the employer of last resort, is a policy that is essentially the government employs everyone who doesn't have a job. Okay, instead of having benefits, unemployment benefits, you actually put people to work in government projects. But those are, I mean, the objective of these programs is to maintain macroeconomic stability, to maintain consumption steady. And then, of course, the idea is, oh yeah, but we'll just put them to do something green. That's not how it works. The supply side needs to be taken care of. The production side, as we were actually starting our conversation, what you produce, where you produce it, needs to be carefully discussed and thought about. And the criticism that we have in our book is precisely that this is not discussed quite as much in the MMT literature, because it focuses much more on the management of aggregate demand in a very Keynesian, post-Keynesian fashion, on the management of aggregate demand, and the supply side is left as, oh, that's going to be relatively easy once we have macroeconomic stability. So those were our main criticisms. Again, we left out of the book the more fundamental. As I said, the ontology of money is crucially different. I was talking to some of the most important MMTers in Europe a couple of days ago, and we were discussing on precisely this: where does money come from? Because MMTers, neoclassical economists, Austrian economists, or Marxian economists, we all have different understanding of where money comes from, what is money ontologically, and we of course all compete for having the better understanding. MMT has a good understanding of a credit system, but then whether money is credit or whether credit can play some of the functions of money is a different question, and on that we disagree, I think.
But Matteo, I was watching a Stephanie Kelton interview, and she was saying, I haven't read the literature, but she was saying that MMT is actually the focus on the supply side. She was saying MMT is focusing on increasing the productive capacity. And
when was this interview?
I can't remember, maybe 2022, 2021.
Yeah.
And she was saying that that's the reason why we're promoting MMT, so we can focus on productive capacity and ensure we don't have...
Yeah. Okay. After the inflation shock of 2022, we kind of all became supply side, interested in supply side. Once you see inflation and you realize, okay, do we have theories of inflation that predicted this? No. So where does this come from? Clearly, the supply side is playing a role in this inflation shock. Then, of course, we all became interested in inflation. We were writing this book in 2020. We were writing this book before this interview was taken. I mean, if you go today and you ask an economist, everyone will tell you, okay, perhaps not everyone, but a large majority will tell you that the supply side played at least a role in the inflation shock of the last couple of years. And of course, if that is the case, then you will have to approach the problem of the supply side much more seriously. When we were writing this book, inflation wasn't an issue yet, because we were writing it. I mean, the book was published when inflation became an issue in 2023, and at that time there was this focus on supply side. Perhaps as I said, there were some words, but there wasn't an actual economic, theoretical and practical focus on it. Again, as I said, saying, oh, we are going to employ everyone and everyone is going to be working, but we'll just put them on a project, on a green project. That's not supply side. That is aggregate demand management, and then you're kind of living how production occurs in a black box, which is a neoclassical theory of the firm. Okay, so looking at how production takes place and how to expand productive capacity, but what kind of productive capacity, that is different. That requires careful planning, and that requires people who have experience in industrial policy carefully tailor the program on a country, or even more on a specific local area within a country. So I mean, I don't know if okay, sure, they have shown some interest in supply side, but never to the full extent, at least to the best of my knowledge.
Okay.
And I imagine it's a risky bet to take to say that we're going to create all these jobs with green technology and spend all this money. We don't know for sure if that's accurate. And now that we have all these inflation risks.
You see, it depends. It can be a risky bet. If the purpose is supply side, it is a risky bet. But if the purpose is macroeconomic stability, and you want to keep consumption steady, then it's a very safe bet, because what you're saying is I'm keeping everyone employed so that everyone is always going to spend roughly the same amount of money, and we're not going to have cycles in consumption. We're not going to have drops in consumption during a recession, because we're not going to have a recession. So if the purpose is macroeconomic stability, then the ELR is a very safe bet. If, on the other hand, is socioeconomic transformation of production system, it is a risky bet. Absolutely it is.
And because we talked about that MMT kind of works with the US, maybe the UK, British pound. Does it work in monetary unions?
What do you mean? Does it work for the member states or?
Yeah, like for the EU, for example.
It
the
cannot
euro.
work, because again, you have to start from the idea that MMT works for monetary sovereign countries, and if you're in a monetary union, you give up your monetary sovereignty for the freely flowing capital. So Italy is not a monetary sovereign country, because its monetary policy is set by the ECB. Although it is carried out by the Bank of Italy, the interest rate policy is decided by the governing council of the ECB in Frankfurt. And they're going to take an average inflation rate of the whole area, and they're going to say, oh, look, this is the inflation rate of the Eurozone. We're going to set this monetary policy. If Italy has a higher or lower inflation rate, doesn't really matter. They're not going to care. Or if Italy needs to have some special types of support, they're not. Again, we're going back to the whole coordination between monetary and fiscal side. If the Italy's government requires some sort of coordination with monetary policy, that's not going to happen. Why? Because the central bank, although Italy has a central bank, de facto monetary policy decisions have been outsourced to the ECB, and they're not national anymore. So anyone within a monetary union is not monetary sovereign any longer. Now, if we had a fiscal union, so if you had like a Eurozone government that carried out fiscal policy, and then you have a Eurozone central bank, then you can talk of the Eurozone as a monetarily independent, monetarily sovereign economy, but as a region. Each of the members is not, however.
And talking about sovereignty, I mean, a lot of criticism that comes to the European Union from individual countries is this loss of, sovereignty. Yeah. People feel like decisions are made in Belgium, and people feel like you can't really vote, and people are making decisions for them. And talking about the ECB, European Central Banks, can you talk about what type of power does the ECB have, and do they supersede the power of the kind of the politicians?
So the ECB is the most powerful institution in Europe, in the Eurozone. It is so because it is extremely independent, in the sense that, again, it has to respond to markets, but at the same time, it doesn't have to respond to national crises. The ECB has to guarantee the working of the euro, and so in this sense, of course, we see it, especially during the Eurozone crisis with Mario Draghi and the whatever it takes speech, that the ECB, seeing that Spain, Italy, Greece, Portugal, and Ireland were facing problems, then the ECB had to react accordingly. But it was a very delayed reaction. Why? Because the ECB is subject to pressures to a much lesser extent than other central banks. So it is independent, legally independent. This is the German influence at the time of establishment, during the 1990s when we were establishing the central bank. It is located in Frankfurt, where it has its own little jurisdiction, and it is absolutely the most powerful institution in the Eurozone, and it does have connections, of course, with the politicians in Brussels, but not in terms of the decision-making process, just in terms of exchange of knowledge. So it is absolutely insulated from political pressure. The only way in which the ECB is not independent is when we're talking about financial market, in the sense that, as I was mentioning earlier, it has to react. It has to react to those shocks that might threat the existence of the euro as a single and common currency. So if there are those kind of shocks, then the ECB will have to respond. Otherwise, it sets its own interest rates. We saw very independently, the ECB was the first one to lower the interest rate in the last meeting. That is the sign of a central bank that is acting on its own. In this sense, it is competing internationally with other central banks.
Could we talk more about the integrity of monetary unions? Because I was reading about the Latin monetary union, which I think was this 19th century monetary union with some continental European countries. And I think Napoleon III, he started it. And the reason he started it was because I think Britain at the time had becoming this dominant power. They've just, they really hit their peak of trade, and France were kind of apprehensive, and they kind of wanted to combat the rise of Britain with their own continental European monetary union. And I don't think it went too well. It dissolved because of the disparate economic conditions in each country. And then again, hearing about the EU and how it started and what you guys say in the book, there always seems to be this overarching economic incentive for its creation, and it kind of seems to be one-sided, like one nation would benefit more than the others. So what are the benefits of monetary unions? Because to me, it kind of seems like they're created because one wants to exert their power even further. So I'm just confused, you know?
So there are some economic benefits, and that is clearly the idea of you have a common money, and as a consequence, trade is facilitated across borders. Companies don't have to use multiple currencies in their transactions, or if you have a multinational corporation that acts in France, Germany, and Italy, you don't have to have different books with different currencies and different transactions and so on. So it allows for the movement of capital. So if you're a French investor and you are investing in Spain, you're not facing the exchange rate risk any longer. So you're not worried about the exchange rate between the two currencies fluctuating during your investment period. So there are economic benefits of monetary unions. Of course, there are. As I said, those that I mentioned are just some of those. If you are a high inflationary country, for example, you can, if you enter in a monetary union with a low inflation country, you might be able to lower your inflation rates. So there are undeniably some economic benefits. However, there is this misconception that monetary unions lead to convergence, and we saw with the Eurozone, but really any monetary union, convergence might take place in some areas, but might also not take place. And most of the times, convergence does not take place. And what you actually have is a hierarchically tiered monetary union, where some...
What do you mean by convergence?
Countries that have different rates of inflation, level of government debt, and other macroeconomic parameters, that by entering the monetary union, they converge. They move towards the same levels, so that it becomes more homogeneous across the union. You can also talk about GDP per capita, for example. You should be seeing them converging towards similar levels. Now, there is economic theory behind it, very old economic theory. Now, as I was saying, there is evidence, however, of the effects of monetary unions in shaping hierarchical relations or asymmetric relationships across its members. And there are multiple issues. There are the issues of surplus and deficits, because something that has been a problem internationally. So how do you settle international imbalances, countries that have deficits and countries that have surpluses, current account deficits and current account surpluses. Internationally, that has always been kind of the trigger for crises, okay, exchange rate crisis as well as banking crisis or capital flow reversals. And in a monetary union, the same issues arise. If money keeps flowing from one jurisdiction to the other, that is an imbalance. How do you settle that, or who should settle that? Should the country receiving the money be the one settling it, or should the country paying the sending the money, the one who's carrying the burden of settlement? So the issue with monetary union is the way in which they're institutionally set up. So they're technical, they're practical. The practical way in which the money work, the monetary arrangement work, is what is going to define whether a monetary union has more or less asymmetries within its members. And the case of the Eurozone shows that doesn't really work, or at least it leads to large asymmetries, but also to a lack of convergence. And I'm not entirely sure if we use exactly these terms in the book, but it is clear that some members in the Eurozone are very subordinate and others are non-subordinate. And it is clear that some jurisdictions monopolize the interaction between the subordinate members and the rest of the world. So if you're an international investor and you want to invest in the Eurozone, regardless of where you might want to invest, you're always going to go through one or two specific countries, Germany, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, even France, because of their financial power, because of a set of characteristics, from the fact that they have large markets and they have developed financial institutions, to the fact that once you enter in Germany, then the money, you have essentially a par valuation with all the different euros in the Eurozone. Meaning you can send €1 from Germany to Italy and it still is worth only €1, and not more, not less. Why? Because there are no capital controls. So it's the institutional setup that matters in that case. There have been proposals in the past that of not for the Eurozone, but for international monetary system, and of course this can be applied to the regional economy. There have been proposals of ways in which you might establish some mechanisms that prevent the asymmetries to pile up, to polarize, but they've never really been implemented. Political reasons again, and technical reasons. It was a very they didn't perhaps have the technology back then. For us now, we might be able to implement them.
But okay, I clearly see there are some benefits as you've outlined. But what are the real world examples of monetary unions benefiting, even let's say these so-called periphery nations, and convergence occurring? Are there any examples?
So countries are all monetary unions. Okay.
Oh, okay.
What matters is whether the size of a country, whether a country is of the right size to have one single money. So you can take, let's take the United States. The United States, technically speaking, it is a monetary union, right? You have states, you have monetary jurisdictions in terms of the Federal Reserve districts, and but you have $1. Now, the way in which it is set up, it works in the United States. It doesn't create the same imbalances. But you can take a much smaller example of a country. I don't know. You can take Iceland, or I was going to say Canada, but Canada is still quite large. You can take whatever country, Italy, before the Eurozone, and 1 lira was in circulation for the whole of Italy. We had regions, but essentially it is a monetary union in the sense that it is a region that is neither too small not too large to have a single money. Now, that is the crucial question. Is the monetary union, a specific monetary union, the right size? And of course, I'm talking about geographical size, but also economic size, like the heterogeneity across the jurisdictions, whether there is high heterogeneity or low heterogeneity, and so on. So the question is a specific area too large or too small for it to have one single money?
Okay.
Perhaps it might make sense for Germany and Luxembourg to have the same currency. Why? Because Luxembourg is very tiny. Germany is very large. They are very well integrated. So it might make sense, or even better, Germany and Austria might make sense because they speak the same language. They are bordering one another and so on. But when you try to put together Italy, Greece, Germany, France, Spain, Portugal, and so on, you see what you're doing is you're putting together countries that have very different economic systems, very different economic parameters, and you're stating that actually doesn't matter the fact that we have this high heterogeneity. This is still an area that is neither too large nor too small to have one single currency. So every single country is an example of a successful monetary union at some point in time. Okay, that does not mean, however, that if we had in the United States two different kind of dollars, it might work better for some of the countries, some of the member states. Okay, so there is a very large literature about this. It's called optimum currency area. This idea of how do you define countries that should or countries that should not enter in a monetary union. Fascinating, however, how the theory behind the optimum currency area talked about preconditions, but then with the Eurozone, those preconditions became consequences. So the whole theory was made so that you had something like 10 parameters, and you would go through these 10 parameters, and you would say, okay, well, if these 10 parameters are in place, then these countries should become monetary union. But then with Europe, what we did was actually first we did the monetary union, disregarding those parameters, and then we said, oh, but those parameters will come up later. Those parameters will converge afterwards because they are endogenous to the common money. That is not what happened. That is crucially not what happened. It's actually what caused the Eurozone crisis. But yes, so those are the theoretical approaches to whether monetary union can be beneficial or successful. Again, it's very difficult to actually establish success or failure, because there will be, of course, I mean, in the end, you can do a cost-benefit analysis, but it's very difficult to quantify it. And there are some positive aspects, but to me, the presence of the asymmetric exchange points to the fact that the institutional setup could be much more beneficial. So most monetary unions could be set up institutionally in a way that is much more beneficial to the development of both the core and the periphery. But that is not done because of politics, because of domestic decisions, precisely as you were saying, of specific countries that might be interested in having the monetary union work for their own benefits.
So do you think the euro much benefits the core rather than the periphery?
Oh yeah, so if you look at the 1980s, 1990s, especially in the 1990s, after the German reunification, there was no hegemony in Europe. There was no country that was hegemonic in the sense with its power, in a hegemonic position in the whole of Europe. What you had were leading countries, and Germany was clearly a leading country, but you didn't have the hegemon. Now, what the euro did was the common and single currency and its own infrastructure was to create the scene that required the presence of the hegemony. So Germany was put in the place of becoming the hegemony because of the euro. So yeah, it benefits Germany, but it's also a burden on Germany, because of course this is something that even we know in the 1950s and 1960s with Triffin. Being the issuer of the key currency, like the United States, has some benefits as well as some costs attached to it, and the conflict between domestic policy and the requirement of the international monetary system, and the same applies for Germany in the eurozone. But what is worth mentioning is that Germany is fully aware that, I should say, the German elite, or the German
The Angela Merkel's,
as well the people in the Bundesbank know that German hegemony in the eurozone is conditional on the existence of the euro, and that's why you've seen Germany always cave when the stability of the euro is threatened, because without the euro, Germany is not a local hegemony. We see it with the conflict in Ukraine and the role of the United States and of NATO. Germany is in no place to be the hegemon in the European region, not even the eurozone, in Europe in general. The reason why it has been at a much tiered much higher than any other countries during the existence of the eurozone is precisely because the logics of money require hierarchies, and nothing wrong with it as long as the hierarchies work. But when you're faced with hierarchies that put a country in an hegemonic position that might not want to be in a hegemonic position, or that might not be able to consistently exert its hegemonic power, then the system might begin to falter. And when the system is then threatened, you see the hegemony intervening to prevent the system from failing and from taking away its hegemonic position. So I've always been I've always thought that Germany never deliberately established the euro to create its hegemonic power, but I think that what happens is that the euro is created, and then the logics of money require the hegemonic power. And in Europe, you really have France that has a lot of financial capital, but the production isn't really there anymore. Italy has great manufacturing sector, but the financial system is not very developed. And then you have Germany that has both very good manufacturing sector, so production, and also very large banks, some very important financial corporations. And so my idea is that really Germany was put in a place in which it was the only candidate that could become a hegemonic power, given that the euro itself required the hegemon.
Yeah, because it feels like, I mean, the euro was started, it seems like, really so they could compete with, these other big,
with
the
dollar.
US, the dollar, and now I guess with China, where they can be one block. But maybe it does feel like, I don't know if that was there in the beginning, but it seems now that the core countries are seeing the benefits of the euros for them, and maybe now they're aware of that and they want to keep that going.
Yeah, that's why the euro, you're exactly right. It was born with that purpose, but that's why it never really lived up to expectations, because the euro doesn't work internally. And if the euro doesn't work in the eurozone.
What do you mean by it doesn't work internally?
We've had the eurozone crisis, right? The eurozone crisis pointed at some structural deficiencies of the eurozone. But the reality is that after the eurozone crisis, we have remained in a situation, kind of a stagnant situation in terms of integration and an institutional development in the eurozone. The euro still doesn't work internally, because although, yes, we have the euro and it's worth all the same in all the countries, behind the curtains, massive imbalances are building up, have built up, and they're still building up, and we don't see any convergence at all. So if the euro doesn't work internally, or it doesn't work consistently as an organizing principle within the eurozone, it cannot work outside. Europe has been trying very hard to the eurozone has been trying very hard to extend the power of the euro by providing facilities to Northern African and Middle Eastern European countries, which are accepting, and because they are still in the sphere of influence, they are using it, but it's not going to become a competitor with the dollar or any other potential world money if it's not consistent internally. And as it is now, it's not consistent internally.
And I want to touch on another monetary union that it talked a lot, or maybe not talked a lot in some sectors, is the CFA.
Yeah.
And the CFA is, well, it's a monetary union now essentially established by France, right?
Yeah.
And it seems like a lot of people that talk about it criticize it, and they kind of use the CFA to represent kind of what colonialism is, and that it has this, this imagery of this colonial power that has control over this monetary union. I don't know exactly the details of how the CFA works, but they say like countries that are part of the CFA have to give their resources to the French central bank. I'm not sure how it works. But then again, the CFA has lasted over time, and there were countries that tried to leave and that came back, like Mali, or certain countries left and had their own currencies, and they completely had, economic instability.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, could you talk a little bit what the CFA is?
So there are two. So the CFA franc, of course, is actually two monetary unions, the one of the West and one of the East. And these are former French colonies that were after World War II were put in these monetary unions, and then as they acquired independence, the monetary unions just remained, and they're still active to the present day. Now these monetary unions are they have central banks, two central banks, one for each region. Again, this is different from the eurozone because the eurozone has one central bank plus all the national central banks, but again, institutional setup. So they have the central banks, but the working of the CFA franc is falls underneath the French treasury. So it's the French treasury. The member countries of the CFA franc have to have an account of the French treasury, and the French treasury is essentially maintaining the value of the franc and its stability, or at least it requires a certain amount of deposits in the account. So there are what you said is correct, and it is indeed true that it is an example of neocolonialism. Now, there are two different ways in which the CFA franc should be looked at, but commentators and academics have only looked at it in one way. So, who is in this monetary union? Because, see, the monetary union is amongst the countries in Africa. Okay, these two, I think it's 6 and 6. It's 12 members in total, if I'm not mistaken. And the commentators, however, have been focusing on the fact that there is some sort of dependency between France and the CFA franc, the two unions in amongst these 12 African countries. nobody has really looked at the CFA franc internally and whether the countries within this monetary union are actually tiered hierarchically. So I agree with you, and indeed, the reliance on the French treasury does point to dependency, but I haven't seen anyone who looks at the actual members of the monetary union, not the guarantor, in a sense, of the monetary union, and whether that monetary union internally is asymmetric or works very well. I don't have an answer because I don't think that there is an answer yet, but I can tell you the way in which it is, the infrastructure behind it, in a way, is much more similar to the United States than Europe, and that suggests that to me that it might actually work better than the eurozone does internally. Again, I'm not assuming that France plays no role in this. Just looking at the monetary union at the 12 member countries. But again, as I said, I don't think that there is any research looking at these asymmetries. I know that there are still relatively strong asymmetric. So their answers to symmetric shock is very asymmetric. So if you look at the sectoral balances, they actually move in very different directions because of their production systems. Some are very export-led countries, and others are not export-led economies. So there is still quite a large degree of heterogeneity across these countries, but the institutional setup of the monetary union internally, not with France involved, is very different from the eurozone. And as I said, it reminds me more of the. It reminds me. It is more similar to the United States or just a country, a country that has one central bank and a lot of regions. Okay, like a little bit like having England and Wales having one central bank, but being two different regions. And so what you were saying about countries that might have left and then come back, it might be because the CFA franc, again, outside of the connection with France, might work internally. But it is then the connection with France that is a symmetric shock to all of the member countries that, of course, represents neocolonialism and should be severed as soon as possible. But I'm not sure that, I am sure you could sever that and restructure the monetary union to make it work, perhaps with different exchange rates. But I don't think that you need to abolish the CFA franc per se, only because you want to abolish the neocolonial tie with the French treasury.
It's quite interesting, and I think the key word you say is as soon as possible. So is it really possible? And I mean, now that and I think this colonial idea is quite important because there has been a growing, movement, especially last year with all the coups happening against colonial powers, especially in West Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. And now there's even, more leaders that are coming in that just really want to push out, these colonial powers. And especially now, like in Senegal, there's a new president that's really wants to push out. He wants to go out of the CFA franc. And I was even seeing, showed me an article that the ECOWAS wants to establish their own monetary union. And I agree with you that it is, going forward, they should, eventually establish their own currency. But how possible is it now? And should it be, how drastic should it be in between choosing, economic stability and pushing away, these colonial powers?
That's a difficult question. I don't have an answer to it. I can tell you that the issue that the countries should be conscious of is that you might cut off the ties with the French colonial power, but you might end up being subordinated to the US dollar. and or to another
or even
money, or
like Russia, like you saw
Russia
a lot
or
of,
the rand, maybe. Yeah, exactly. Clearly, the dollar is still the currency that we are using for primary products, for exchanges in primary products, and these countries tend to be exporters, or at least, or also importers of primary products. So, it's we should be conscious that we don't really want to replace one hegemon with another, or one dependency with another. I also know of peculiar things happening in the monetary infrastructure in the African continent. Like if you look at the southern countries in Africa, the South Africa is trying to expand its reach and the reach of the rand, precisely not with monetary union, but with the monetary infrastructure behind payments and exchanges. So it is trying to establish its own local power with via money, but without a monetary union. I do think that it is viable for African countries. ECOWAS is the one that you mentioned. There have been, for ages, there have been plans of having an African-wide common currency. That's not going to happen. Or, let me rephrase it. You can have an African-wide common currency, but it doesn't have a common and single currency. You might have still national economies, but then have a system of clearing at the international level, at the continental level, where you say, okay, for all cross-border transactions with one another, we use this other currency, and we record surpluses and deficits, and we set out a mechanism that tries to rebalance deficits and surpluses, so that nobody is going to have a burden for the repayment, or that the burden of repayment is shared equally amongst deficit and surplus countries. That is possible. Again, it becomes then a matter of a vested interests and economic and political economy. These proposals were made for the international monetary system in 1944 by Keynes as well, something similar at least. Didn't win. Why? Because there was an American plan, the white plan, and then there was the British plan, and the U.S. wanted to establish its own hegemony and saw the internationalization of the dollar as the linchpin of its hegemony, and that's why they went with the monetary system of Bretton Woods. So if you're able in the African continent to come up with a plan and to put it through the, of course, political process, there are, and especially these days with all the technological development with digital currencies and central bank digital currencies and so on, you might very well be able to establish institutionally coherent monetary union that serves that allows to reap the benefits of the common money without also bringing the cost of having a single money for all the members. Because I think when we think of monetary unions, we tend to take for granted that a monetary union means a common and single currency for all the members, but it doesn't have to be the case. We can have common currencies that are not the only currencies that we use in our countries, or in the well, in our countries we're going to use our domestic currency, and then for cross-border exchange we might use a different one. So I think that is possible. Of course it is quite a revolution, because it's never been done before. But I do think that actually it's never been done before because of the technological requirements that were not there. So in 1944, if you go there and you imagine having a system, an accounting system, so that all countries have domestic payments and then cross-border payments that use a different currency, and then you clear them, and then establish a method to have balances, surplus and deficits that expire, it becomes very difficult. But now that we have programmable currencies, for example, I do think that it is easier and it is more feasible to actually have a clearing union, for example, or some monetary arrangements that allow to reap the benefits of the common, but not the issues of the single money in terms of the development of a monetary union. Yeah.
Oh wow, that was fascinating.
I don't know. These are ideas, and I've been talking and working about it. There needs to be, in the end, a political will. Economics can only go so far.
I think would you say that's what gets in the way, is the
of course,
politics always?
Yeah, of course.
And isn't that what the EU, they kind of rejected this notion of surplus, countries that ran surpluses wouldn't be able to pay for countries that ran deficits?
No, in the EU, it's all underneath the rug. We don't talk about it. It's if you don't talk about the problem, there is no problem. The actuality is that there is the problem, and right now, if Italy or Greece, they want to get out of the Eurozone, they would have to pay overnight half of their GDP in balances that they owe to the core, essentially, or to the rest of the union. So essentially, it's also becoming a blackmailing mechanism, because nowhere is written that if you get out, you have to pay these balances. But whenever you start asking, okay, well, I'm Italy, I want to leave, somebody would come up and say, oh, please do remember that there are these 600 billion euros that need to be paid tomorrow if you leave. And this is half of your GDP. So, wow. Yes, politics gets in the way, but politics sometimes is also the origin. The European Union and the Eurozone was a political project. The economics was supposed to make sense afterwards. They didn't realize that perhaps you cannot build a system out of friction. At some point, the system built out of friction breaks down, and you need to rebuild it altogether.
Oh, just on a last note, I want to know, we're talking about money and how, financialization has moved forward and evolved. And now the new form of money that was created is cryptocurrency.
Yeah.
Talking about, this new, maybe monetary unions, that they didn't have the technology back then. So I want to know your thoughts. What are your thoughts on this new technology? And
okay, so DLT.
Yeah. And where do you think it'll go, in the future?
Yeah. So complex question, and we're working on it. We're working on understanding. Cryptocurrencies aren't really money. What are cryptocurrencies, first of all? There is a plethora of cryptocurrencies. So we should be talking really about DLT-based money, so money on the distributed ledger technology. And but if we are taking the example of Bitcoin, Ethereum, those aren't money, or they acquire some of the. I don't want to get too specific. But they acquire some aspects of commodity money, some of the forms of money when gold was money, but they're not really money. So if, however, then we explore central bank digital currencies, which can be DLT based, then we start talking, or better, we shouldn't be confusing them with cryptocurrencies, because central bank digital currencies, they would be liabilities of a central bank, whereas Bitcoin isn't a liability of anyone. So this is why cryptocurrencies in general is a very broad area. Now, in terms of CBDCs, which I suppose we can call, they're part of cryptocurrencies. Again, it's an institution. It's a matter of the institutional setup. They can be slightly dangerous for the stability of the legacy financial system, because, of course, if you have a central bank that creates a central bank digital currency, then why do you need banks anymore to provide a deposit account, current accounts? But again, that's a matter of the institutional setup. So that's why central banks are spending lots of money and lots of time in understanding what are the threats and how to prevent the CBDC hurting the legacy financial system. But they might be, if you have these programmable currencies, they might actually work very well if you want to be a little extravagant with the monetary arrangements. At least that's an exploratory thought that I have in my mind. No, but if your question is more about Bitcoin, then I can tell you it's not money. It has some money forms, so it has some forms that appear like money or that look like money, but then we would be entering this whole issue of value and what is value in the digital economy, and it's a totally different question, and it becomes difficult to answer. But no, cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin, the private cryptocurrencies, they are not money. They are financial assets. They're not money in an MMT sense because they're not issued by anyone. In this sense, they look much more like gold, like commodity money, and that's why we say that they have some forms of commodity money, but they're not credit. And if your understanding is that credit is money or money is credit, either way, then they cannot be money. Whereas central bank digital currency, even if it is DLT based, can be credit. It can be a liability of the central bank. Just it's essentially replacing the banknotes, which are money, legal tender, but there are also credits by the central bank.
Especially looking at the fact that gold is a good example. The fact that Bitcoin has a limited amount of supply.
Yeah,
that's really interesting.
It is interesting, but that's a financial asset. That is purely speaking a financial asset. The fact that it has a limited amount of units in circulation, it's just a feature of the financial asset. And I mean, if you buy stocks, there are a limited amount of stocks in circulation, and unless they issue more. But it's pretty much the same idea. Of course, it's slightly different because, again, stocks are liabilities of a corporation, whereas the fascinating thing is that Bitcoin is not a promise to pay anything. So if the question really is, okay, one can start with the question, what is the value of money? And then there are different ideas. Some would say money has no value. Some would say money, the value of money is what you can buy with that money. And others would say, well, the original value of money was the amount of commodity in that money. So if you had one coin made of gold, the original value was the gold in that coin. Then, of course, it can be detached, but the original at least. So if you ask this question and now you apply it to Bitcoin, what is the intrinsic value of Bitcoin? What is the use value? It has no use value. So you cannot use Bitcoin to satisfy any of your needs or wants. You cannot do anything with Bitcoin. Of course, you can exchange it. So it has an exchange value, but a use value. In use, you cannot do anything with it. So it doesn't have an intrinsic value. Yet it is traded at a very high price. And that's why we say it has some commodity form. It looks like a commodity, even if it's not a commodity, because it has no use value. These are Marxian terms in a sense, because they're very useful when you're looking at the commodities as goods that are goods and services that are produced with the purpose of exchanging them, and Bitcoin is very peculiar because it has no use value, but it has an exchange value, and so it's impossible to determine what its intrinsic value is, but it still has a high exchange value or a high price. So that is fascinating. Again, as I said, we would be entering the whole idea, the whole discussion of digital commodities and so on. But hopefully, perhaps another project like this one comes out of our conversations that we are having on the side. But I think that is as much as I can say. I think the distinction amongst the different kind of cryptocurrencies is fundamental. And yes, the question is about cryptocurrencies, but the reality is when you're asking a question about cryptocurrencies, you have in mind only one of the several different types of cryptocurrencies. Private,
really,
public.
the two. There's like the main ones, and
Yeah, there are private, there are public, but then there are again, cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin that are issued not as a liability of anyone, and cryptocurrencies that are issued that make use of similar technology, the distributed ledger, but that they represent a liability of the central bank. Crucially different, economically speaking, diametrically opposed concepts, but using similar technology or the same technology. So the question then is, are cryptocurrencies defined by their economic role or by the technology that they use? Is it DLT technology, or is it something else that defines what a cryptocurrency is? I have, of course, my interpretation of it. I think that we should be looking at the technology and then look at all the different types of cryptocurrencies that use the same technology or similar technologies that are comparable. And but some might say, look, CBDCs and Bitcoin, they're so different that we shouldn't even be calling both of them cryptocurrencies. They should, perhaps only Bitcoin should be a cryptocurrency, and CBDC should be called, I don't know, CBDC and nothing else. So that is a matter of definition. I think it's all so very new that we don't really, we are still making it on the go, and even central banks. That's why we don't really have many CBDCs around, because even central banks don't feel perhaps comfortable enough to put them in place, or they're trying to put them in place. And as building a monetary, that is essentially building a new monetary system. You cannot just turn it on one day and let it work, because it's going to either collapse or replace the old one. And if it's going to replace the old one, then you find yourself with a commercial banking system that is collapsed overnight. And that is not good. That is not good, because then who's going to take over the role of banks?
But this is what fascinates me, is the world we're looking at going forward, because a lot of people are calling for the end of the old fiat system, and they want to go back to is it right to say commodity or commodity based financial system,
commodity money,
and I always think, because we're so used to this fiat system and how credit has just been expanded and how it's spread up investment and easy money, essentially, if we were to go back to having some scarcity at the basis of our financial system, what does that look like? Could we be able to finance all that we have financed in the past?
Well, no. You would have to deal with extremely deflationary pressures, and it would be a totally different scenario from the globalized system that we've seen in the last half a century. But the reality is that fiat money has been around for centuries. It would be very different if we were to go back. Well, no, that's the point. We cannot really go back to a commodity money system, because I do think that the what's called the crypto maximalists, what they have in mind is go to a system where you use Bitcoin and there is no central bank whatsoever.
Yeah.
Whereas in the past, we have had central banks or monetary authorities. They still had commodity money, but then who can decide what the value of the coin was just by stamping a number on it? So we've had combination, and the history of monetary system is fascinating because it takes a long time, and we have different money forms that coexist, and the process of replacing one with the other is not as straightforward. And so at least in my reading of it, we had the monetary commodity-based money, and then it developed and was replaced by a fiat, not a fiat, but a credit system. But the fiat overlapped the two, because again, as I said, you could have a coin that had X amount of gold in it, but if you stamped on it a different value than the amount of gold, then it was still then the number stamped on it was what was the value of the coin, not the material in it. So for a brief, not so brief, but for a period of time, we had these combinations of commodities, but fiat, or and then eventually credit. I think the issue with the crypto maximalist thinking is money is a thing, credit is another one, and because of the current monetary system and the cartelist approach of MMT that we've discussed earlier is part of it, there is this tendency to equate credit and money and to say money is credit, credit is money, full stop. My take is different. I do think that we need to have a monetary theory of credit, that money predates credit, although credit forms acquire some of the purposes of money. But I do think that the crypto maximalists confuse the two, in the sense that they think of going back to Bitcoin. It's not clear to me, once you go back to Bitcoin, what happens to banks in their mind. How do you finance if you want a mortgage on a house? Or do you even need a mortgage on a house if you're using Bitcoin now? Because clearly, they want to replace the monetary system with a commodity-based money, but I have never heard any of them make any statement on the credit system. How is credit going to be managed? Who's going to issue loan? Who's going to give out loans? Are loans still going to be there? Are we going to just have institutions that accumulate Bitcoins and then they lend out Bitcoins that are not in use? If this is the case, then that is going to be a massively contractionary force in the economy. We moved away from that system because we needed more, quote unquote, money in circulation.
And that's what I think they perhaps don't really address, or even how we deal with recessions. What would be the approach under this system? Or perhaps are they alluding to this quasi-commodity based and also credit-based system, which kind of combines, and I don't know the ins and outs. But
I suppose some of them, without even knowing it, might think in a very heterodox approach that the credit cycle dictates recessionary periods. And in a sense, if you take away credit, you will take away recessions that are caused by credit. But when you have an exogenous shock,
what do you do?
What do you do? Exactly. I know that some of them have ideas of treasuries within the cryptocurrency, like that accumulate and that spend, make some investments. But no, I think there is large confusion between legacy financial system, I mean the financial system that we have right now, and monetary and money as such. Because clearly we confuse, or better, I mean, even Marx himself, not to be one of those people who says, oh, Marx said it, but Marx himself talks about, it's important because of the methodology of doing economics. So they're working on different levels of abstraction. But Marx himself talks of this idea of money confusion, meaning we talk about money, but in reality, with the same name, we refer to very different phenomena. So when we talk about money, if I tell you, send me some money, if you give me a banknote, and if you send me a bank transfer, we are talking, I'm still fine, and I'm still telling you, send me some money, and we still understand each other, but you're sending me to very different things that then are connected to one another because of the fact that the central bank allows the commercial banks to go to it if it needs to have some of the currency to put in circulation and so on. But they're different things. So as a society, we are confused about what money is, because money, the same name, has come to cover so many different forms of money. And I think that within the Bitcoin cryptocurrency debate, this confusion will come to light if that transition appears, because we will realize, oh, wait a second, we were talking about money, but we were talking about central bank money, physical money, bank credit, non-bank credit, and so on and so unit of account, and so on and so forth. And if you just say, "Oh, we replace all of those with Bitcoin," that does not make any sense. You might be able to replace the official money, if you want, with Bitcoin, and then you leave banks out. But then banks are going to have to issue credit in some other instruments because they're not going to accumulate Bitcoins. And it's simply not going to work for them to accumulate Bitcoins and lend them out. So I do think that there is a bit of confusion on how monetary and financial systems work, and how they overlap and how they do not overlap at all in some other areas, and those are not really answered. If you want to follow the cryptocurrency, the crypto maximalist, you need to rethink not only money and credit, but the whole system of government, because you really are getting rid of monetary policy, but you also need a totally reinvented fiscal policy and industrial policy, because now you're going to have treasuries that are creating cryptocurrencies and are spending it. And so you're only going to have a fiscal policy in a sense. It's not even fiscal policy any longer, but and then you have CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, but those might actually be a big disappointment, in the sense that those might end up being exactly like cash, just in a digital form, which to me is a bit of a disappointment, because you're excited, there is something new, who knows what it's going to be. But the way in which, in order not to be disruptive for the legacy financial system, it seems that it might go in the direction of simply being a replacement for cash.
So essentially,
using some fancy technology.
Okay. So essentially, these Bitcoin maximalists are just a bit too idealistic, would you say?
Idealistic, yes, but also perhaps with the wrong idealism.
Oh, okay.
Perhaps, actually, it could be potentially interesting to have someone, some maximalist, explain their understanding of the monetary and financial system, and how monetary and credit relations intertwine, and how they would play out in a crypto-based monetary system. I don't think this has been discussed, because we are always worried about the value of money, not how money works. Or the conversations around Bitcoin have always been focused on inflation and the erosion of the purchasing power of money. But practically, I don't know how they would put in place the system of credit that is the backbone of any economic system, a capitalist economic system, at least.
Okay.
Matteo, thank you so much.
You're welcome. It was a lot of fun, actually.
Yeah.
Had a great time, learned lots, and maybe we'll get a Bitcoin maximalist.
That would be interesting.
thrash this
Actually,
out.
then you can call me back, and then we can have.
Because we also do like panel discussions. Like I have, where two people, discuss two point of views.
Fun.
That would be quite interesting.
Yeah, definitely. I'm down for anything. So yeah, or perhaps another book.
Yeah.
Who knows?
All right, Matteo, thank you.
Thank you for having me.